All right, good evening, 晚上好. So tonight is part 2, 今天晚上是第二部分. And setting the Christian standard part 2, 就是制定基督教标准第二部分. And we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 5 through 8. 帖撒罗尼迦前书第二章5到8节. Verse 5, 第5节. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness, 因为我们从来没有用过谄媚的话，这是你们知道的，也没有藏着叹息，这是神可以做见证的。Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. 我们做基督的使徒，基督的使徒，虽然可以叫人尊重，却没有向你们或向别人求荣耀。But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. 只在你们中间存心温柔，如同母亲肉养自己的孩子。So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. 我们既是这样爱你们，不但愿意将神的福音给你们，连自己的性命也愿意给你们，因你们是我们所疼爱的。All right, so last week we started looking at 7 virtues of a Christian. 上周我们开始看到基督徒气大美的 and this is something that if you want to know what your Christian life should look like, this is an idea of what the normal Christian life should look like. 然后如果你想知道你的普通的基督徒的生活应该是怎么样的，那我们就看到看到保罗还有别的使徒他们的生活可以很快知道。And so you could say that you could argue there's a lot more than 7, but these 7 are very, very standard. 然后你可以说，其实牧师也有7个多美的，但是我们这7个是很普通的。And as Christians, we got to remember, like, over the last 2 weeks, someone's been talking to me about how Christians, this person's asking that, what happens if a Christian sins? What should a Christian do? 然后呢，过去这2周里有一个基督徒，他问我，如果基督徒犯罪的话，该怎么办呢？ And so one of the things that they've been that this other church has been teaching them is that if you sin, then you're not a Christian, and that you're going to hell. So what does a Christian life look like? And so when we look at like Paul's life and we see how amazing his life is, it's very easy to look at that and think, I can never be a Paul. 然后我们看到了保罗的生活，我们就是觉得，哇，他的生活是那么好，他是真的很好的基督徒，我跟他完全不一样的。然后呢，我有个朋友，他另外一个教会在教他，如果你犯罪一次，那你要去地狱，你不是基督徒，所以你要好好改好自己。And so let's look at this, because this is we're going to look at 7 different characteristics of a Christian. 然后我们要看到7个对基督徒的like 态度。And this isn't saying like, okay, if I'm 4 out of the 7, I'm a Christian. But if I'm only 3 out of 7, I'm not a Christian. 然后呢，我们也不能说，如果你只有觉得4个适合你现在的基督徒的生活，或者你觉得3个，但是4个还没有那么适合你，或者你没有做那么好，那这个意思不是你不是基督徒。We're just looking at this, and this is something. So this is just kind of like you could say like a litmus test. This is kind of like a test to see, am I like this? Because this is what the apostles exemplified to the churches when they were going around teaching them. And Paul here does many things, not just him, but also Timothy and And Sila, which is, I just looked at the name earlier today. How did I forget it? Yeah, Silvanus. And they're setting up is it Silvanus? His pronunciation?
Paul and Silas.
Silas, but the spelling's a little different. Anyways, 所以这三个弟兄，然后他们现在教这个教会他们的生活应该是怎么样的？是喜乐 Timothy 还有保罗。And so last week we looked at the first three. 上周我们看到1到第3个, and the first one was honesty. Christians don't continually throw around words of flattery. So one of the things that as Christians that you see in the apostles and the disciples, starting the disciples and transitioning over into the apostles, is that they are, especially Paul, you don't see them saying, this and that about Christians to make them feel good. They speak the truth, whether it's a Christian wants to hear it or not at that moment. 然后我们看到在他们的门徒的时代开始，特别是在信徒的时代的时候，我们看到很多耶稣的使徒，他们对别的基督徒告诉他们真理，可是有的时候真理是有点受不了，或者有的时候是比较严格，或者你觉得嘿，为什么他说这句话让别的人或者别的教会有点不舒服。And it's not that Paul is trying to make it seem like it's impossible to live the Christian life, but rather he's trying to teach them, not that just one church might know, but that all the churches in the later generations to come can follow suit. 然后保罗不是只有叫一个教会比较严格的要求，但是什么？是为了所有的以后的教会。所以有的时候，如果你觉得嘿，他真的很严格，是因为这个教会需要的，但是也是为了我们。So if you look at some of his writings, you think wow, he was so strict. But that's not just for the one church, but also for all of us. And so one of the things that we looked at last week was that honestly, Christians don't continually throw around words of flattery. And Paul, that's one of the things that Paul did, is he didn't just come in and say a bunch of things so that people would praise him and receive him. Sometimes he said things that got other people upset at him. 然后保罗没有去一个教会说很多甜话，或者很多反常的话，是为了让他们喜欢保罗，或者觉得哇，保罗你这么好，你这么棒的使徒，他只有说真理，然后有的时候别人受不了真理，但是他说了我们基督徒应该是这样子。And sometimes when Paul spoke the truth, it made people upset. And it wasn't that Paul was trying to get people upset, but rather he's speaking the truth. And he could have gone to church and said nice things in every single church he went to. And then when he leaves, every single church will be like, wow, what a great guy. Never any criticism, never any calling on us. And he could have did that, but he doesn't do that. Because he's not so much worrying about his reputation as he is the health of the church. 但是你知道吗？保罗可以去所有的教会，跟他们说很多好的话，很多甜话，很多反常的话，但是他没有。为什么？因为他最重要的是什么？不是他自己的面子，是什么？是这个教会是健不健康的教会。So is this a healthy or not healthy church? So he wasn't necessarily worried about his reputation, rather the health of the church. The next one we looked at is that another characteristic of a Christian is that we have self-control. 第二个是我们基督徒的态度是什么？是自我控制。And so self-control and this is something that Paul mentions a few times. It's mentioned in the New Testament a few times. 然后你知道吗？自我控制几次在新约保罗会分享。And so self-control is, and I would say every single Christian can always be improving upon this. 然后我自己觉得所有的基督徒，不管你是一位牧师，或者你是学生，或者你是老板，不管你的工作是什么，如果你是基督徒，我觉得我们都可以继续进步，自我控制。And so self-control could mean many different things in your life, because some people are very good at, let's say, some people are very good at at doing and completing their jobs. They're very good. If the boss or the parent gives them a task, they're good at doing it and then finishing it on time. Some people aren't. 就比如有的时候基督徒他们来上班的时候会做很厉害。如果老板说今天下午3点你要给我这个工作，那他们下午可能2点50就交给老板他们的工作，他们就是很认真的。或者有的时候有学生，如果父母告诉他们你要今天我想你帮我打扫卫生，那他们不会忘记了。But other Christians, but some Christians, but that's just one part of self-control. 但是就是一部分自我控制。Sometimes it might be, for example, it might be sleeping. So when we talk about self-control and Paul being self-controlled, this was something like every area of his life. It wasn't just with preaching the word, but it was in every area of his life, because that was something like Paul's life was always being watched. And Paul knew that and realized that. And he was self-controlled when it came to managing money. He was self-controlled when it came to taking money from one church to another. He controlled all these different areas of his life, because he knew that he was going to be, people, whether he wanted to or not, would be looking up to him, especially now, later on. And there is, 然后保罗就比如如果他要把一点钱交给别的教会，他知道很多人在看他的生活，所以他必须自我控制他自己的生活，自我控制他什么时候要离开一个城市到另外一个城市，他也需要自我控制，他要把多少钱去另外一个教会，给他们多少钱，所以他真的控制他自己，真的控制他的时间，真的控制他的计划。So for example, Paul, he had self-control in many different areas when it came to time, because he knew he was always pressing on. Like if he had to take money from one church to another church, he didn't just say, well, I'll do it when I get the time. He was very, very particular. And if there was ever a church need that was, if a need needed to be met in a different city, and Paul knew about it, he made that a high priority. But the only way he was able to do that and to fulfill these tasks is if he had self-control, especially managing time. So that's one of the things that is seen in his life. So 我们看到保罗的生活，特别是来控制自己的时间，还有机会，我们都知道保罗是做得特别的好。然后上周我们看到自我控制 ，Christians do not covet things from the heart, and so coveting is just one area of self-control. 所以我们说上周是基督徒不会贪心欲内心的东西，然后就是coveting 贪心只有一个自我控制的地方。And so coveting was something that Paul talked about. And Paul specifically says here, he goes, when I went from one church to another church, I didn't covet any of your guys' stuff, especially money, because one of the things that was going around during this time was that Paul, even though he was greatly loved by Christians, he also had a lot of enemies. And some of them would say things like, Paul is only in this for his own reputation. Paul is only in this because he can make money. Paul is only doing this because he wants to be liked by so many people and then have control over them. 然后你知道吗？对，保罗是特别的好的基督徒，还有很多基督徒特别喜欢他，但是你知道吗？他也有好多敌人，好多仇敌。然后他们平常说保罗他只有做使徒是因为了赚钱。保罗是只有做使徒是什么？是因为他想控制所有的教会。保罗只有做好的使徒是因为他自己的面子，没有别的意思。The next one was consciousness. Christians realize God is always watching. 第三个是良心，基督徒意识到上帝总是在注视着。Now this might be an interesting thing of you might say, well, this is an interesting virtue. 然后你可能说就是有点有意思的美的。But as Christians, way more so than non-believers, that us Christians, especially with myself, we have a very, what's up?
Is it conciseness or consciousness?
I think that's a misspelling. It should be consciousness, like an
Okay.
awareness.
Okay.
Yeah. What did I say? What?
You have its conciseness.
Okay. But the Chinese is, let me see.
良心.
Liang Xin is like consciousness means like an awareness.
Okay.
The Chinese is right, I just the English is wrong.
Okay.
不好意思，那个英文是不对，但是中文是对的。
Okay.
中文的意思是 like 发心的，对吧？就是 like 在你心知道了。So as Christians, one of the things that makes us a Christian is that we're always aware of that God knows, that God sees, that God hears, and that even if other people don't know, God still knows. 然后我们基督徒都知道什么？我们都知道上帝他听到了，上帝他看到了。上帝他已经知道了。And this really shaped Paul's life and his theology and the way that he thought. 然后这个真的帮助保罗，还有控制他的想法，他的思想，因为他知道上帝知道了。If other people don't know, if other churches don't know, that wasn't such a big deal to Paul. Because Paul knew that God always knew the truth. God always saw. Whether it came to managing money, whether it came to managing time, whether it came to speaking the truth, even if other people didn't believe him, Paul knew, and he knew in his heart, in his mind, that God knew the truth. And that sooner or later, God would reveal that truth. 然后保罗他老是知道，上帝已经知道了。如果别的基督徒或者别的教会觉得他做的不对，或者不好，或者他们不知道真理是什么，保罗也不害怕，因为他知道上帝已经知道了。And so he had an awareness of this, a consciousness of this. 所以他知道这个问题，他知道。So now we're at number 4. And that shaped the way that he lived out his Christian life. 然后这个是超级影响他基督徒的生活。然后我们现在到第4个。And now we're at number 4. Humble. 谦卑. Christians never seek their own glory, be it inside or outside of the church. 无论是在教堂内外，基督徒从来不寻求自己的荣耀。So here's the thing. You might be thinking, well, sometimes I'm not humble as a Christian. 然后你可能对你自己说，但是有时候我不是那么谦卑的。Sometimes I'm prideful. 有时候我是骄傲的。And if that is you, 然后如果只是你，如果你自己觉得是这样的 let me just tell you that is, I'm not in no way am I advocating this, but I would be very hard pressed to say there is no Christian that at some point in their life does not struggle with pride, whether it's in the heart or it's expressed, because it's something that all of us struggle with. Some maybe a lot more than others. But if a Christian says, I've never struggled with pride, I would have a really hard time believing that. If they said that, I've never in my life struggled with pride. Like, okay, well, who do you love more? Do you love your neighbor like yourself? If you don't, why? Could it be because there's an area of pride in your heart? Anyways, 所以如果基督徒对我说，我从来没有骄傲，或者我从来没有不会骄傲，或者他们觉得我没有骄傲的地方，我真的很不那么相信。因为我们基督徒，如果你现在觉得你不是骄傲的，这个没关系。但是你的基督徒生活肯定有的时候遇到骄傲的地方。就比如，如果你没有那么完美爱上帝，那这是为什么？为什么是可能是因为你更爱你自己，还是你想做你的自己的目标或者什么的？ So as Christians, this is something that we should always be striving for. And Christians are usually marked by humility. 所以我们基督徒，我们要比较努力追求谦卑的生活，谦卑的态度。Verse 6, 第6节 Nor of men sought we glory, 却没有向你们或向别人求荣耀。And so why would Paul be doing this? Because think about this. During this time, this is the church age, the beginning, so to speak, of the church age. 然后就是教会的时代刚刚开始了。And so this was, you could understand that if you are a businessman, you're stepping back. 然后如果你的工作是老板，然后你看到 and you see this, and you see all of a sudden all these Christians are starting to pop up all over these different cities. 然后你看到很多城市这里有一些的基督徒，那里有一些的基督徒，后面也有一些的基督徒。And then you're starting to see these little communities of Christians starting to pop up all over. This would be, if you are a businessman, you might be thinking, hey, this is something, we can really cash in on this. There's a lot of these Christians starting to pop up, and they're sticking together. And when people see this, you realize that this is something that's maybe new, something popular. It's very like 火, and you might be thinking as an unbeliever, hey, you can make a lot of money doing this. 然后你知道吗？如果你发现了你是老板，你也不是基督徒。那你看到这个城市有一些基督徒，那个城市也有一些基督徒，后面的城市也有很多基督徒。然后你发现了这一些的基督徒老是在一起，平常聚会在一起，然后你会发现，嘿，这是很火热的公司或者队，然后你觉得你可以赚钱的方法。However, Paul and the guys that he was with, they never did this for glory, even though it might have been the popular thing. Even though Christians, whether good or bad, had a strong reputation. Sometimes a lot of people hated them. Like, for instance, the Jews wanted them out. But people still knew who they were. And with that always comes a sense of this, especially if you're a Christian, you're the Apostle Paul and other Christians looking at you, it's very easy, very tempted, or temptation can creep in to want to become prideful. Because look at how many people are starting to follow you, right? 然后你知道吗？如果是好还是不好，基督徒那时候他们的 reputation， 他们的名字，更多人知道了。然后呢，如果他们恨他们或者爱他们，很多人已经知道基督徒是什么。然后如果你是保罗，那你肯定是更有名的基督徒。然后很多人可能感觉，嘿，这个人真不错。很多基督徒也是更知道，很多基督徒会听他的话。Why? Because Paul has a good reputation right now. 因为保罗现在的名字是挺好的 in the Christian community， 就是基督徒的聚会。But Paul says, we didn't do this for you guys. We didn't do this to seek your glory. 但是保罗说，我们没有做这句话是为了你们的荣耀。And so as Christians, so what can we learn from this? 然后我们基督徒可以学习什么？ That as Christians, this is, when we do things, especially when we're serving in the church, whether you're writing letters like Paul, or you're church planning like Paul, or you're trying to instruct people in the church, whether it's through writing or verbal communication or whatever, teaching, don't do it for your own glory. Do it for the glory of God. And don't do it so that you can receive praise and honor and glory from other people. That's what Paul's saying. 然后你知道吗？如果以后你也自己开教会，或是以后你在教会开始教别人，或者长大或者写教训什么的，我们也需要学习什么？不要为了别人的荣耀，或者别人给你赞，或者为了你自己的名字，要做这句话，要做是为了什么？是为了上帝。And Paul is saying here, despite what people said about myself or Timothy or Silvanus, we're doing this not so we can receive praise and honor and glory from you guys. We're doing this for the Lord. 然后呢，保罗说，不管是我或者提摩太或者希拉，我们做这一切的东西不是为了你们，也不是为了我们自己的名字或者你们的荣耀，是为了什么？是为了上帝给他荣耀。然后我们基督徒也应该是这样子。And this is the year is just starting off. 然后现在是新一年刚刚开始的。And as Christians, I have no idea what God's going to do in your life this year. 我不知道上帝在你的生活要做什么。Maybe this year, this church could explode and get very, very big. Maybe God's going to use you in this church to do something incredible. I have no idea. Or maybe God's going to give you some type of a new job. And maybe you're going to make a lot of money. I don't know. But whatever you do, as Christians, we do it all for the glory of God. Even if God decides to lift you up, like he did with Paul. So many people know who you are. Because Paul was, at this time, very, very famous. Why? Because he's the church starter, one of the originals. 然后今年我不知道上帝要对你生活要做什么，他可能要给你新一位的工作，然后你可能赚很多钱，或者他也可能让这个教会发展很快，然后 上帝在这个教会给你特别的工作，特别的机会释放他，然后以后很多人知道你是谁。如果上帝说这句话，不要赚钱，不要工作，不要在教会释放，是为了面子，或者为了钱，或者为了别的问题。要做什么？是为了上帝，为了上帝的荣耀。And if God does decide to make you very popular like Paul, just remember, do it for the Lord, not for yourself. Because if you do it for yourself, guess what's going to follow? The temptation to become prideful, become arrogant, maybe even become like a dictator, whatever. But if you're doing it for the Lord, that will keep your focus in the right place. And it won't be for money, or it won't be for reputation, or whatever. 然后如果你做是为了上帝的荣耀，那这个会控制你，控制你的爱的地方，也控制你的面子。但是如果你做是为了赚钱，或者是为了你自己的面子，那不是为了上帝的荣耀，而且会给你很多骄傲的诱惑。And as Christians, never in the New Testament do you ever see Jesus teaching that Christians, or any of the apostles, or any of the writings, or in the Old Testament, that Christians, God's people, are to be proud, to be prideful. Never do we see that. It's always something of humility. 然后呢 a lifestyle of humility. 然后在旧约或者新约，耶稣或者他的使徒们从来没有说我们基督徒的生活应该是很骄傲的生活。是什么？是谦卑的。And I know it's very easy when you're looking on Douyin, or you buy stuff on Pinduoduo, or you look at the news, and you see people are very, very prideful. Even a lot of athletes are very prideful. And that attitude is very, very contagious, meaning it's very easy for us to see that and to take that and want to apply to our lives. Because it's all around us. But that's not something we see in Scripture. 但是你知道吗？如果你在刷抖音，或者拼多多，或者看新闻，或者你看运动的比赛，很多人在我们的周围都是特别的骄傲的。然后呢，我们的文化现在觉得这是 OK， 如果你自己骄傲的没关系。但是我们基督徒的生活发生了什么？骄傲在我们基督徒的生活没有位置，没有地位，因为骄傲也是犯罪。And that's what Paul says. We didn't seek your glory. We didn't seek our own glory. We didn't seek anyone else's glory. But for the Lord's sake. 然后保罗他说我们做这句话，我们做这件事，不是为了你们自己的荣耀，也不是为了我们自己的面子，是为了上帝的荣耀。So number 4, humble. Christians never seek their own glory, be it inside or outside the church. 第4个，谦卑，无论是在教堂内外，基督徒从来没有寻求自己的荣耀。Number 5, diligent. 勤勉。Christians strive not to be burdened upon others, not to be a burden upon others. 基督徒努力不成为别人的负担。Verse 6, so the last part. But the Chinese is actually the front. Oh, this is interesting because the Chinese and English is literally reversed. 所以你看到中文英文就是要反过来，因为英文是后面的，中文是前面的。Neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. 我们做基督徒的使徒，虽然可以叫人尊重。So this is extremely interesting. This always has fascinated me about Paul. 我自己觉得就是非常非常非常有意思。我真的对保罗这件事有很多感兴趣。Because Paul says, look what Paul says in the English at the very end. It says, as the apostles of Christ. What is he saying? In the very end, in the Chinese, it's actually in the beginning. 然后你看到中文，英文是最后的是 as the apostles of Christ， 但这是中文是全面的。In the Chinese, it's actually in the beginning. It says, 我们做基督徒的使徒。So what is Paul saying here? 那保罗在这里说什么？ He's saying this is a title. He's saying we are as apostles of Christ. I'm an apostle. These guys are apostles. And with that comes authority. With that could come, you could say, power. Power what? To control churches, to control people, because people are going to, if you're a Christian, you're going to listen to the Apostle Paul. Maybe this guy's a Christian is rambling about something, you might be like, oh yeah, whatever. But if the Apostle Paul is speaking, people are going to listen. Why? Because he's an apostle. Christ chose him. 然后你知道吗？就是一个 like title， 他是使徒。然后如果保罗开始说很多教训或者句话，很多基督徒会听，因为就是一个 title， 就是耶稣选择他。但是如果普通的基督徒就开始叫你，你可能说，哎，我不听。但是保罗开始叫你，你肯定很认真听。And Paul says, look at this. Paul says, because we are an apostle, I'm an apostle, I never use that title, that authority, that power to be you or anyone else's burden. What does he mean by that? 然后保罗说了什么？我是耶稣的使徒，但是我从来没有用这个权利、这个位置，为了成为你或者别的基督徒或者别的教会的负担。What does he mean by that? 这是什么意思？ He means that Paul says, as an apostle, he could have gone to church and used that and say, hey, I need to collect some money. I need to collect, as an apostle of Christ, hey, you guys need to help support me. He could have used this, and he could have became a burden upon not only Christians here and Christians there, but across every church. He could have used that as an opportunity to make money, to become a burden. Or he could have said, hey, I'm an apostle. When I come to your house or when I come to your city, I expect to have room, board, new clothes, new shoes, some money, and the best food. Oh, and I also want to have a tour of the city. He could have used that. And then people are like, oh, Paul's coming again. Oh, man, can someone please direct him to another city? We don't have time for this. 然后你知道吗？保罗可能说，我准备去新的城市，说，嘿，我马上到你们的城市，你们可以准备新的衣服、新的鞋子，还有最好的吃的地方，帮我订酒店，而且我需要 A234，还有我到这个新的城市可以找一个人带领我去看看旅游这个城市。但是他从来没有说这句话，因为他是使徒。他也可以说，嘿，我是使徒，我需要你们给我1/10。但是他没有说这句话。He could have said, hey, I'm here for tithes. I'm here to collect tithes for this church and that church, and I also need tithes too, because I'm an apostle, and you guys have to support me. He never did that. He could have, because later on he actually talks about how if a person is good at preaching and teaching, that they should receive money through what they do. Paul himself says that later on. But you don't see him ever saying that about himself. 然后你知道吗？以后保罗也说了，如果牧师在长大，有人成为一位牧师，那他说如果他做好的话，那他应该是就这个工作应该给他工资。但是保罗从来没有说这句话。And it says, he goes, I do to the Thessalonians, and I do to any other church. And I didn't become anyone's burden. Not just me, but also Timothy, who's with me, and Silvanus, who's also with me. 然后保罗说了，我也不是对你们，而且也不是对别的城市、别的教堂、别的教会，我自己或者提摩太或者希勒成为你们的负担。Because think about this, some of these churches had almost nothing. 你知道有一些的教会，他们的东西什么都没有。Some of them had a lot more money than others. For example, the church of Laodicea was very, very rich. 就比如Laodicea 怎么说我忘记了，就是启示录第3章最后的教会，他们真的有很多钱啊。老底家的教会超级有钱 very, very rich. But some of the other churches were very, very poor. 但是你知道吗？别的教会真的很穷，没有钱。And could you imagine if Paul, Timothy, and Silvanus came here and like, hey, we're going to stay here for the next 6 months. And during this time, we're going to need you guys to help support us with food, clothing, shelter. And if they're already really poor and really struggling, then they would what? They would become another burden upon them. Yes, the Christians would be happy to accept them. But there's going to be some Christians thinking, how are we going to afford this? How are we going to pay for room and rent? Where are they going to stay? Who's going to buy the food? We don't even have enough food to feed our own family, our own kids, let alone these guys. 然后你知道吗？有一些的教堂真的没有钱。然后如果保罗、希勒还有提摩太到很穷的城市、很穷的教会， 说嘿，我们要留在这里6个月，但是我们需要你准备吃饭、睡觉的地方、衣服什么的，你需要提供我们。但是他们也可能说，但是我们现在什么都没有，我也没有那么多好吃的给我的孩子们，还有你们。And Paul didn't do that. 然后保罗这没有做这句话。And as Christians, one of my personal convictions is that as a missionary pastor, this is one of my personal convictions is that there are a lot of pastors or missionaries that really abuse this. And I'm not saying every single pastor, every single missionary does this, but I've seen it a lot. When I came to China, I know people that have done this. And I personally think that this is a great sin. And we don't see Paul doing this. 然后你知道吗？我到中国5年半前大概，然后我也遇到别的基督徒、别的牧师、别的 like missionary， 跟我一样的离开他们国家到中国，然后成为别的教堂的辅导。我真的感觉就是非常不好，但是我们从来没有看到保罗做这句话，我们从来没有看到他做这件事。And as Christians, we should strive to be diligent, whatever it is that God has placed us. If you're a student, be diligent being a student. If it's at work, be diligent being at work. If it's to be a wife, be a diligent wife. If it's a husband, be a diligent husband. Whatever it is, we should try to be diligent in everything we do. 然后我们基督徒，如果你是学生，那你要做好前面的学生；如果你是老板，做真的很好的前面的老板；如果你是老婆，前面的老婆；老公，前面的老公；学生，前面的学生，什么的。And that's what we should be, because that's what we see. That's what we see the Christians like. 因为我们看到这里的基督徒是这样子 ，they didn't become a burden. 他们没有成为别人的负担。And I'm not talking about what I'm not saying. 然后我的意思不是 is that if you're struggling in life right now, maybe you don't have money, or maybe you lost your job, or maybe your health's really bad, and you need other people to help you out. That's not what I'm talking about, because Paul addresses that also multiple times. Not a lot, but he did it a few times where he collected money from a bunch of different churches to take it to a church that's in dire need. But it wasn't an ongoing thing. It was something that he helped out when it was needed, but then when they got back on their feet, they were on their own. 然后你知道吗？我的意思不是，如果你现在是没有钱，或者没有工作，或者你的身体不是那么健康，所以你没有办法工作，这不是我的意思。而且我们看到保罗他几次有一个教会没有那么多钱，所以保罗去几个城市说：“嘿，你们可以帮我给我一些钱。”因为我要把这个钱交给哪个教会，但是这个教会那个没有钱的教会，以后他们长起来，他们不会继续交给他们钱，只有帮助他们而已。所以我的意思不是，如果你现在遇到困难、遇到难过的事，这不是我的意思。我的意思是，如果你现在没有问题，但是还成为别人的负担，就是真的，你要好好看看，好好考虑你现在的生活，你现在的做法是好还是不好。So what I'm saying is that right now, if there's nothing major wrong in your life, and you become like someone else's burden, and it's been that way for a long time, then think about that. Think about that, because we don't see Paul or any of the other apostles doing that. What I'm not saying is that if a person is struggling in their life and, they need help, whether it's financial help or it's help spiritually or it's help in a family, that's good. That's okay. But if it's like people that I've seen when I've been in China and when I was in seminary, we talked about this too, is that some pastors, some Christians, they do this and they rely years and years and years on total support from other people. You don't see Paul doing that. And he finds different methods. And if he needs to raise money, he raises money. If he needs to support himself, he supports himself or whatever. 然后保罗，我的意思是，如果你是一位牧师， 或者基督徒，然后很多很多年，别的教会继续交给你钱，你要好好考虑你现在的做法是好还是不好，因为我们从来没有看到保罗做这样的事。我们看到保罗，如果别人需要的帮助，他就帮助他们；如果需要赚钱，那就赚钱给他们。So number 5. Oh, look at Proverbs 21:5. I actually talked about this last Sunday. 箴言21章5节 says, "The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteous, but of everyone that is hasty only to want." 眼前筹划的，自知丰裕，行事急躁的，都必缺乏。And so Paul, for instance, like no, one of the things you'll notice is that out of all the churches that he helped to start, 然后你发现保罗开始这么多教会。Every time he went to a new city, he wouldn't say, "I'm only going to be in this city for 6 months and then leave." He would stay there or leave depending on the need. 然后我们看到保罗，他从来说我要去所有的城市，就留在哪里6个月。他会什么？他会看到他们的需要，他们的要求是什么。然后如果他需要花更多时间，他就花更多时间。如果是比较短，那就是比较短。然后他看到每个情况不一样的。But whatever he did it with all of his heart. And Paul would look at the circumstances, and if there was one city, he was there for over 3 years. But in others, it's only 6 months. So he looked at the need and then poured all this time and energy into that area. And then when it's finished, he would move on. Or when it's ready to be taken over by other people, he would move on. And Paul adjusted his time and then towards the needs of that place. 然后保罗他改变他的时间，就是对于而关于那个城市基督徒的需要的地方。然后呢，就是告诉我们什么 ？That his thoughts were diligent. Why? Because when he came to a city, and he found out that these Christians here have a ton of issues. For instance, like the Corinthians. As a matter of fact, did you know he wrote 3 letters? There are 3 Corinthian letters. The third one we don't have. Did you know that? So why did he write 3 letters to the Corinthian church, but other churches he didn't? Because they were really, really messed up. You have a guy sleeping with his mom. You have all this other stuff going on. Other churches you don't see that. 你知道吗？哥林多，我们现在有2个哥林多前后续对吧？但是你知道吗？还有第3个，但是第3个我们现在不知道，没有找不到。但是他写了3个，为什么？因为这个教堂的问题超级多。就比如有一个儿子跟他的妈妈一起上床，但是别的教会没有那么多的问题，所以我们也看到有一些教堂，他可能只有写一封信，但是别的他写几个，因为他看看他们的需要的地方是什么，然后就改变。And then he would change to meet their needs. 然后就对他们的要求就改变。And the very end, Paul said what? 然后最后的保罗说什么 He said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith." 然后最后保罗说什么？那美好的仗我已经打过了，当跑的路我已经跑尽了，所行的道我已经守住了。And if Paul didn't have a diligent life when it came to this, could he have said this? 然后如果你知道吗？如果保罗的生活，他基督徒的生活不是那么勤勉的，你觉得他可以最后的生活说这句话吗？当然不可以。And if Paul wasn't diligent, do you think at the very end of his life he could have said this? If Paul had many areas where he had regret, do you think he would have said that? He'd say, "Oh man, I really wish I would have spent more time in this helping these Christians there. I really wish I wouldn't have, wasted so much time in that city with those Christians." No, because he planned out and he adjusted the times to the people's needs, because he was diligent with the task that was given to him before him, and also very diligent with the gifts that God gave to him. 然后他也是对他的天赋，还有他的时间，还有他的机会， 很勤勉的。And so at the very end of his life, he says what? 所以他最后的生活是什么？ He says, I've finished. I've completed, you know? 然后他说什么？我做完了，比赛结束了。You know, that's what all of us Christians want. 我们所有的基督徒都想听到这句话。You know, even if you're like, well, I'm just a mother. 然后你说我只是一个妈妈而已。Well, guess what? Guess what? You know how did you know Timothy was what? Timothy was what? He became a pastor. Timothy 成为什么？一位牧师。Do you know who Paul equates to Timothy becoming like a separate person too? Take a guess. The woman who raised him. He talks about how his faith was found in his mom and his grandmother, those who trained him. And think if his mom and his grandma had not had that big of an impact on him, do you think he would have become a pastor when he got older? Don't know. But Paul equates that to his mom. So if you're just a mom, or if you will be a mom in the future, you know, you could be raising future pastors. You don't know. 然后你知道吗？提摩太保罗以后说你的信仰哪里来的？他以后成为一位牧师，对吧？那谁给他最大的影响？保罗没有说他自己，他说是什么？他的妈妈，而且他姥姥。然后他说你的信仰是从他们来的。然后如果以后你也是妈妈或者爸爸，然后你说啊，我只是普通的基督徒，我只是一位爸爸或者妈妈，没有那么大的意思。但是你不知道以后你的儿子可能成为一位牧师，或者你的女儿可以成为一位牧师的老婆或者什么的。You don't know， 你不知道。But in everything that we do, we should be diligent. 但是我们不管以后我们生活是怎么样的，都需要勤勉。Because you don't know how God's going to use it， 因为你不知道以后上帝要用你的时间、你的生活成为别人的祝福。Number 6, meek。第6个，温顺。Christians are marked by character of meekness. 基督徒是以温顺地性格为特征的。So, I don't know. When you hear the word meek, what do you guys think of? 然后你听过 meek 就是温顺的，你想起来什么 ？As an American， 我是美国人，对吧？中国美国人。Anyways， 中国美国人。When I hear meek, I think of a if I think of someone say a meek guy， 然后我说这个男生是很温顺的 ，I think of a guy who's very weak。我觉得他没有 like 肌肉 ，and I think of a guy who is very easy to be pushed around。然后我觉得这个人可以很容易，你说要做这个，或者你去哪里，然后他就听你的话。And I think of a meek person as a person who might also have a false humility. 他可能有 like 假的 like 谦卑的态度。And I think of a meek person as probably also someone who doesn't stand up for himself. 然后我觉得这个人不会 like 保护自己。Like for example, if someone else is insulting him, he might just start crying. 然后如果别人 like 骂他，他可能开始哭什么的。But that's not what it means here in Scripture. 然后这里的 meek, 这里的温顺不是这个意思。It says, "But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children." 是在我们中间存性温柔，如同母亲乳养自己的孩子。So the reason why I chose meekness here, because this is an idea of what this verse is talking about. 为什么我选择温柔的吗？因为就是这个经文是这个意思。是 meek 的意思。For example, when Jesus says the meek shall inherit the earth, he's talking about weak people that can be bossed around and pushed around. That's not what he means. 然后耶稣说，就是 meek， 就是温顺的，那个经文是温顺的 ，shall inherit the earth， 就是地球是他们的。那耶稣的意思是这个是就是比较怎么说？ Like English, we could say like a girly man or just a guy who's very weak. Like the woman's, like his wife is always in charge. Like in Chinese, what word do you guys use for that? 就比如这个人，他的老婆都是头，家庭的头。这个男生没有 like backbone， 他没有自己的肌肉。 他都老是听别人的话，这不是耶稣的意思。This has to do with the character， 这是一个态度。And this is 温柔的男生，就是这不是保罗的意思。Paul is talking about what？ 保罗是什么意思？ Paul is talking about so for example, Paul, what he means to make here is that if there's an issue in the church, 就比如如果这个教会有很大的问题 Paul could have become extremely upset, extremely short-tempered, could have lashed out at them and said, how dumb are you guys? How many times do we have to teach you? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? But you don't see him do that. You see him what? You see him treating the church as what? As little children. And his attitude of meekness. Why? Because there might have been a lot of people were attacking him verbally. And he doesn't respond in retaliation. He doesn't respond by attacking them back. He doesn't respond by getting upset or angry or cursing them. He doesn't do any of that. He has a meek character. As like a mom to a little child. 然后巴洛，如果别人在骂他，或者教会里面有好多问题，他从来没有骂他们，他也从来没有说我已经教你那么多次，你还忘记了吗？没有生气，他就是对他们是一个父母，一个父亲，对他的孩子，了解这个孩子很多东西不懂，所以我要更爱他，更照顾他，要更好养他，跟他为他什么的，就是保罗的意思。And he's not trying to create problems to create problems. He's not that type of a person, not the type of person. 然后他不是创造问题是为了成为别人的问题。他给他们更多的耐心，更多的忍耐。He gave them more patience, and was concerning towards them. He wasn't short-tempered. Like all this kind of fits in with what it means to be meek. 然后就是都是关于温顺的。And as Christians, this is something we should strive for. And this is, for some people, this might be really difficult. 然后我们基督徒，我们都要追求这样的态度。但是我知道对有些基督徒是可能是更难过的，我知道更难做的，我知道。但是我们还要追求这样的。Like for example, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." 英文意思说，温柔的人有福了，因为他们承受了土。Wow, it really uses. That's interesting how the Chinese there. 中文我觉得很有意思 because anyways, it just means like in the English we say the Chinese like you could also translate it as being soft. But that's not what Jesus means. Like if you say a soft guy in English, that means the guy probably can't fight, can't stick up for himself. 然后如果你说这个人这样是很 soft， 这个意思是他不会跟别人来吵架，因为他没有能力，他是有点垃圾的。但是这不是他的意思。As Christians, we should strive to be meek. 然后我们基督徒要好好学习保罗的方法，我们应该是温顺的。And the last one, love. 最后的爱。Christians bear an uncanny love for the brethren. 基督徒对弟兄们的表现出一种不可思议的爱。And this is I know we last few months we went over like Christian love, and I think it was like 8 parts as we're going through the Gospel of John. 然后我知道我们好像3个月前我们做基督徒的爱是怎么样的，然后就是好像有8个部分，然后都在约翰一书。And so Paul is everything Paul did was driven by love for God, love for Christ, love for the church, love for the brothers and sisters. 然后保罗他做什么都是为了爱上帝，为了爱耶稣，为了爱教堂，为了爱教会，为了爱弟兄姐妹们。Verse 8, 第8节 So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear to us. Like Paul honestly really cared for his people. Honestly, he did. He loved the churches. 然后保罗说什么？我们既是这样爱你们， 不但愿意将神的福音给你们，连自己的性命也愿意给你们，因你们是我们所疼爱的。他真的爱弟兄姐妹们，他真的爱他的教会，他的所有的教会。所以我们知道他的道理是什么？他的道理是爱。So we know what his like agenda or what his objective was to love. And love was what motivated Paul. His love for Jesus, his love towards God, his love towards his fellow brothers and sisters, love towards the church. 然后激发保罗的是爱，就是对耶稣、对教会、对弟兄姐妹们。And everything he did. The reason why he didn't want to become a burden to them is because he loved them. 为什么他不想成为他们的负担？因为他爱他们。Why did he spend more time? Why did he write 3 letters to the Corinthian church? Because he loved them. He wanted to help them. He didn't want them to, for Satan to come and destroy the church. 那为什么保罗给哥林多教会3个信？是因为他特别的爱他们，不想撒旦来攻击他们。And that's the same reason why he didn't become a burden here. Is like he goes, and you guys know this. Why? Because he loves them. 然后他知道不想成为他们的负担，因为他超级爱他们。So how do we understand like pastors or Christians or churches that do put all these burdens upon people just to make money? Because there are churches that do that. That we know that's the opposite of love. 然后那我们这么了解 like 牧师还是教会给很多有穷的人很多负担，为了1/10，为了这个教会或者这个牧师可以赚更多钱，这不是爱。And one of the things that I can't that whenever I hear when some pastors they want to always just be cynical and always attack a Christian and saying like nitpicking every single sin. And there are Christians that when they hear this, when they see this, it just gives them more and more and more and more burdens. And they feel like when they fall, that they can't get back up. And when they start to get back up, the pastor comes and runs them over. Because of something that the pastor said, and they hear it, and they might misrepresent it, like, wow, the pastor's always saying this, blah, blah. And they feel like I can never break free from this sin or whatever. And they end up wanting to leave the church, or they want to do something crazy, or they say something crazy. Because they're not getting the help that they need. And that pastor's just giving them more and more burdens. 然后呢，如果基督徒有一些的牧师，他们给他们的小羊很多很多负担，就比如如果有一些的基督徒，他们的嘴比较多，老是摔大了，然后他们慢慢长起来。但是长起来的时候，他们听牧师说，如果你是这样的，那你不是基督徒什么的。然后这个牧师其实给这个基督徒很多很多负担，很多压力。然后以后他们觉得，那我不是基督徒，然后他们想离开教会。那这是爱吗？不是。所有的牧师，我们应该跟保罗一样的。如果他们有更多的罪的话，我们应该帮他们一起长起来，不要老是批评他们什么的。批评他们有好的地方，但是更好的是你帮他们一起长起来。And I know that, when you have some Christians and they have more sin than others, it's very easy to criticize and say, well, you're just not a Christian, or you really need to check your heart. But what's harder to do is when they fall down, to get down and pick them up. You guys each together stand up. Find out what their problem is or their problems are and help them. Don't just always say, well, you're probably not a Christian or whatever. Because, that might be helpful once or twice, but if it's always being said, it has diminishing returns. And so love, you see, yes, Paul does call out sin. But he also, if there's issues, he goes in person and helps. He doesn't just attack over letters. 然后对，保罗会写信，有时候如果别人犯罪的话，他就 说你们要悔改。但是如果他们真的说到的话，他会跟他们一起长起来。And as pastors, we should be doing the same thing. Paul, what did he do? Sometimes when they fell down, Paul got down and helped them up together. He didn't just criticize them, but help them out and help them through their weaknesses. And this is displayed by what he did. Why? Because it says at the very end, because you were dear unto us. Were dear unto us. 为什么？因为最后他说什么？因为是我们所疼爱的。And if a pastor really loves his people, his sheep, the church leaders, they will want to help them. They want to get them restored, want to help them, not just attacking and give burdens upon them. 然后，如果牧师真的爱他的教堂、他的教会，他会什么？他想他们都悔改，可以被耶稣医治了，所以他不会给他们很多负担、很多压力。他会更爱他们，更想帮助他们。And so the 7 Christian virtues are what? 所以基督徒的7个美德是什么 ？Honesty, 诚实 self-control, 自我控制 consciousness, 良心 humble, 谦卑 diligent, 勤勉 meek, 温顺的 and I, and love. Let's pray. 我们祷告。Heavenly Father, we thank you for tonight. We thank you just for all your provision, your blessing, and your grace. 然后主啊，感谢今天晚上的聚会，感谢你提供，也祝福你的帮助。And Lord, just help us as Christians to grow in all these areas. None of us are perfect. 然后主啊，请你这7个态度帮我们都提高，因为我们都不是完美的。And Lord, we love you. We thank you just for your word and for your patience towards us. 然后主啊，我们真的爱你，真的很感谢你，因为你对我们给我们很多你的忍耐，你的帮助，感谢你。我奉你耶稣基督的名求，阿们。